The first thing Marcus Vale knew when he woke was cold. Not the cold of a room with poor heating, not the cold of a draft under a door, the kind of cold that had weight, the kind that pressed down through stone walls and lived in the air like something with a pulse. He'd been on a dozen frost worlds in his years of work, and each one had its own flavor of freeze. This one tasted like iron and old sky. The second thing he knew was warmth. There was warmth at his left side, warmth he hadn't earned and couldn't account for. He lay still, eyes not yet open, running an inventory of his body the way any man who'd survived enough of the wrong situations learned to do before moving. Ribs sore, bruised, nothing cracked. Left arm, a specific deep ache from shoulder to elbow that told him he'd been cut and treated. Back stiff but intact. Head no concussion ring, no nausea. He was alive. He'd been alive for some hours at least, because the wound in his arm had moved past burning into the duller register of healing. And there was still warmth at his left side. He opened his eyes. The ceiling above him was carved stone, pale gray-white, veined with threads of blue mineral that caught the low lantern light and turned it into something like Starfield. High ceiling, old work. The kind of construction that told you someone had been building on this world for a very long time and had never once compromised on the statement a ceiling could make. He was in a bed. Not a field cot, not a medical slab, an actual bed, with deep furs over him and a frame of dark wood that had been carved and fitted with the kind of patience you could only spend when you weren't worried about time. He turned his head. She was asleep. The Queen of Vare, the Ice Sovereign, the title his handler had used when briefing him 3 weeks ago in a way that suggested he should feel honored and terrified simultaneously, was curled against his left side with her face turned toward his shoulder and her silver hair spread across the fur between them. She wore no crown. She wore the layered underdress of her court robes, the stiff outer layers having been removed, and her feet, he noticed, were tucked up behind her the way a person sleeps when they're cold themselves and close to something warm. She was using him as a heat source. He did not move. He had woken in strange places. He'd woken handcuffed to a radiator on Keleth Station. He'd woken in a medical bay after a bad breach on Duravan with 3 surgeons arguing over his arm in 2 different languages. He'd woken in the back of a transport after someone had decided it was easier to move him unconscious than to explain the situation. But he had never woken with a queen asleep beside him, and he was experienced enough in impossible situations to understand that moving suddenly would be the worst thing he could do. He looked at her face. Without the court makeup, the silver-white pigment on her cheekbones, the formal lines drawn from her outer eye corners back toward her silver temples, she looked younger. Not young. She was not young. The fine lines at the corners of her eyes said she'd seen decades worth of difficult decisions, and the tension that lived in her jaw even in sleep said she never fully stopped carrying the weight of her throne, but younger than she performed. She had the kind of face that was hard to read in the court, where she composed it with deliberate precision, every expression a word in a language that told her subjects exactly what she allowed them to know. Asleep, she was just a woman who was tired. He tried to piece together the last thing he remembered. The corridor, the east wing of the Vare fortress. He'd been on the job for 6 days, contracted by her first chamberlain to serve as an outside observer during the treaty negotiations with the Selhari delegation. It wasn't the strangest contract he'd taken. His actual function, as opposed to the function listed on the paperwork, was to watch the room while the politicians talked and notice anything the Queen's own guards might miss because they were too accustomed to the architecture. Fresh eyes on a familiar space. He was good at it. He'd done it on Pelion, on Marsh Station, twice on Greyvault. He hadn't expected the knife. In fairness, neither had anyone else. The Selhari delegate, 3rd seat, junior rank, a male whose name Marcus had noted but not yet associated with threat, had moved in the corridor after the evening session. moving toward the queen, moving fast. Marcus had been the closest person in the corridor, who was not either a dignitary or a guard with his sight lines badly positioned. And he'd done what his body had learned to do in the years since he'd first taken a contract that required him to be between a principal and harm. He'd moved. The blade had been meant for her neck. It caught his left arm instead, from shoulder to elbow, and the force of him slamming his body into the delegate's path had put both of them on the ground in a way that involved the stone floor with considerable commitment. After that, things got blurry in the way they always did, when blood loss started talking louder than the rest of his nervous system. He remembered the sound of her voice giving orders, sharp, flat, precise, not panicked. He'd thought, even then in the gray-out, that it was a remarkable voice, the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed, and had been obeyed long enough that the expectation had worn smooth into certainty. He did not remember being moved here. He looked at the ceiling again. He looked at the lantern on the stone table beside the bed, turned low. He looked at the fur pulled over both of them, a single covering, long enough, which meant it had been arranged that way rather than arrived at accidentally. Someone had tucked that fur. He looked at her hand, resting just below his ribs where she'd curled against him. Her fingers were long, the nails tipped in the silver-blue pigment of Vare royalty. Her skin was the pale blue-gray of her people, cooler at the surface than humans ran, and he was aware with a clarity that was slightly absurd given the circumstances that the warmth between them was largely his own warmth, conducted through the furs, which she had arranged herself against and then fallen asleep within. She had come to his room. Or he looked around again. She had brought him to hers and then stayed. Either way, she had stayed. He was still deciding what to do about this when she moved. Not waking, she shifted the way people shifted in light sleep, turning her face slightly, and her hand tightened briefly on the fur near his ribs. Then her breathing changed, and he knew she was coming up. He did not look away. She opened her eyes. They were the color of pale winter sky, that blue-white that existed for about 40 minutes on a clear morning before the light changed it. A color he had no name for, which bothered him in some distant intellectual way, because he liked having names for things. She looked at him for 3 full seconds without changing her expression. Then she sat up. She did it smoothly, without haste, the way she did everything, with the specific unhurried quality of someone who had decided long ago that appearing flustered was not an option. She moved to the edge of the bed and sat with her back to him, shoulders straight, and he heard her take one controlled breath. "You're awake," she said. "Yes, Your Sovereignty." "How is your arm?" He flexed it experimentally, pain but managed. "Functional." She stood. She crossed to the stone table with the lantern and stood with her back to him for a moment. He watched her adjust the lantern wick, which did not need adjusting. "My physician saw to you last night," she said. "The wound was deep but missed the major vessels. You will have full use of the arm in time." "I appreciate that. You saved my life." He said nothing, because he was not sure what she was expecting him to say to that, and he had found over the years that waiting was almost always better than filling silence badly. She turned. Her face was composed again. The Queen's face, not cold exactly, but without the soft unreadability of sleep. Her hair was still loose, silver-white falling past her shoulders, and she had not yet put the court face back in full, which meant he was probably still seeing more of her than she intended. "My court," she said, "will have opinions. I imagine they will. A queen who is found to have spent the night in the chambers of a human mercenary. Or," he said carefully, "a queen who is found to have ensured the survival of the man who took a blade for her." She looked at him. Something moved in those winter sky eyes, not anger but something sharper. Assessment, maybe. "You have a distinction to offer." "Framing," he said. "Not a distinction, depends which story gets told first." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The delegate is in custody. The Selhari leadership have sent formal apologies. The treaty is suspended pending investigation." "That's fast. I move quickly when someone tries to kill me." He believed it. He'd seen her face in the corridor in those last seconds before the grayout, the immediate calculation behind her eyes, the rapid assessment of what had happened and what needed to happen next. Not a woman who wasted time on shock. "You could have had your physician attend me in a separate room," he said, because the question was there, and he had learned that letting questions sit unanswered was a different kind of problem. "Why am I here?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I wanted to know," she said finally, "when you woke." It was not the full answer. He knew it wasn't the full answer. But he also knew when someone had given him everything they were prepared to give in a single exchange, and he filed the rest of it in the part of his mind that held things to return to later. "Then I'm awake," he said. "Yes," she said, "you are." The court had opinions. He'd known they would. He'd been in enough courts, alien and otherwise, to understand that courts were opinion-generating machines, and that any input which deviated from expected behavior would be processed into faction and whisper with remarkable efficiency. By the time he was allowed out of the royal chambers and installed in a proper guest room, a significant step up from the mercenaries' barracks allocation he'd been given on arrival, the whispers were already moving through the fortress corridors like a cold draft under a door. He heard them obliquely, in the way you heard things in buildings that had never been designed with acoustic privacy in mind. The fortress of Ver had been built for grandeur and defensibility, not discretion, and sound traveled along its stone corridors in unexpected ways, bouncing off the blue-veined walls, pooling at corridor junctions, arriving at points the speakers had not intended to reach. He heard fragments, enough to piece together a picture. The human in the Queen's chambers. The Queen seen crossing the corridor at the third night hour, alone, not attended. The physician summoned, then dismissed, then summoned again. The Queen's morning appointments cleared by order. The guest room they'd assigned him was on the 4th level, Eastern orientation, which meant the view was the fortress's inner courtyard rather than the plateau. He sat at the window for a while and watched the Ver fortress staff go about the work of a royal household. The careful choreography of people whose daily labor was the infrastructure of power, the cooks and servants and record keepers and maintenance workers who made the whole enterprise possible. They moved with the unhurried competence of people who knew their jobs, and occasionally one of them looked up toward the 4th level window in a way that suggested his presence had been noted. The physician who came to check his arm in the mid-morning, a small, precise woman named Ditha who had the focused disinterest of all good medical professionals, told him nothing directly but answered his questions with a careful neutrality that told him more than words. Yes, the Queen had been seen leaving her own chambers in the night. Yes, the timing had been noted. Yes, there had been a Chamberlain's inquiry about what exactly the human had said or done to require such personal attention. "And what does the court believe?" he asked. Ditha wound fresh binding on his arm with practiced efficiency. Her hands were small and precise, and she worked with the economy of someone who had performed this particular task many thousands of times and no longer needed to think about the mechanics of it. "The court believes many things simultaneously," she said. "That is the court's nature." "What does the first Chamberlain believe?" A pause, measured precisely. "The first Chamberlain," she said, "believes that her sovereignty's behavior since your injury has been irregular." "Irregular how?" "She visited twice during the night. She gave specific instructions that you not be moved to the infirmary. She canceled 3 scheduled meetings this morning." Ditha tied off the binding and stepped back, examining her work with the critical eye of someone who did not accept anything less than correct. "The first Chamberlain has served the Ver throne for 40 years. He has served Queen Verith specifically for 11. He has not seen her cancel meetings before." Marcus thought about the ceiling of that room. The lantern turned low, the fur arranged across both of them with the quality of a deliberate act. Someone had tucked that fur. He kept returning to that specific detail, the physical actuality of it, the moment in which someone had arranged the covering across him, and then arranged herself beside him and stayed. There was no administrative explanation for it. There was no political calculation that explained the whole night. "She stayed the whole night," he said. Deetha picked up her case. "I am a physician," she said, "not a chronicler." She walked to the door, then stopped without turning. The wound was not complicated enough to require the monitoring she performed. If that is useful information, I offer it. She left. He lay back on the guest room bed, smaller, less extraordinary than the one he'd woken in, but still finer than anything in the barracks, and looked at a plainer ceiling and thought about a queen who had sat beside a mercenary's bed for an entire night when she did not, medically, need to. He thought about it for a long time. There was a version of this in which he handled it with the professional detachment appropriate to a contracted operative in a complicated political environment. He could write the incident report, the knife, the corridor, the injury, the recovery, the subsequent access to a level above his contracted station. He could list the risks. He could write up the recommended exit, accept the formal thank you, receive the probable financial compensation that a life-saving act warranted, and close the contract gracefully. He was good at exits. He had made a career, in part, of knowing when a situation had reached its natural conclusion and leaving cleanly. He stared at the ceiling, and the recommended exit kept not feeling like the right shape. It kept not fitting the specific weight of warmth at his left side when he had opened his eyes, or the unguarded face he had seen before she put the court face back on, or the carved stone animal turning in her fingers at the north window. He was still there when the afternoon light shifted, which was not a decision he'd made so much as a result he'd arrived at by failing to make a different one. He was on his feet by the second day, arm in a brace, moving carefully. The Vare fortress was larger than it looked from the approach, which was to say it was enormous, and the approach across the frozen plateau had already suggested something substantial. Inside, it was a series of interconnected structures built over what he suspected was centuries, each addition absorbing the previous in the way old buildings do when they outlast their original architects. There were corridors that made no geographic sense, halls that opened into smaller halls that opened into courtyards sealed against the frost, and everywhere the blue-veined stone of the local geology cut and shaped into something that stopped just short of beautiful and landed instead on formidable asterisk. He had done a thorough walkthrough of the sections relevant to his original contract in the first days after his arrival: the treaty hall, the guest wing, the east and west approaches to the formal rooms, the corridors between. He had mapped them in the way he mapped all spaces he was professionally responsible for: exit points, sight lines, the places where a person could stand and not be seen from the angles that mattered. He had been good at his job, and the job had required this kind of attention, and he had applied it with the ease of long practice. Now, with no contract technically in effect and no active assignment, he walked the fortress differently. Not mapping, something else. He moved through it the way you moved through a place when you were trying to understand it rather than defend it, with slower attention, noticing different things. The way the light changed in the inner corridors as the day progressed. The places where the ceiling height dropped and the stone felt older, the additions not yet having absorbed fully into the original structure. The smell of coal and iron, and the specific resinous note of whatever fuel the lanterns burned, which was unlike any fuel he'd encountered on other worlds, and had a quality to it that was not unpleasant, something sharp and clean that cleared the head. He explored with the careful unhurriedness of a man who had nothing else scheduled, and was pretending not to have a specific destination in mind. He found her in a room that was not on any map he'd been given. It was at the end of a corridor that curved in the wrong direction for the section of fortress he'd thought he was in, a navigational irregularity that had pulled at him precisely because it was irregular, and which he followed without entirely choosing to. The door was not marked. It stood open a few centimeters. He heard her voice, not the court voice, not the command register, something quieter. He did not go in. He stood beside the door and listened, and what he heard was not words but tone, the specific sound of a person talking to themselves, working through something, the way people thought out loud when they were certain they were alone, with the unguarded cadence of private reasoning. He pushed the door gently. She was standing at a window. The window looked north, which meant the view was the plateau in its full winter expression, white and gray, and the occasional dark line of rock where the wind had cleaned the surface. She was in a simpler version of her court dress, a working robe in dark blue rather than the formal silver and white, and she was holding something in her hands, a small object he couldn't see clearly. She heard the door. She turned, and for a moment, a fraction of a moment, the kind that people edited out of memory because they didn't fit, her face was still in that private mode. Unguarded. Then it wasn't. Mercenary. Your sovereignty. This corridor isn't on the access plan I provided. No, he said. It isn't. And yet here you are. Here I am. She looked at him with an expression he was beginning to be able to read, not the court mask and not the sleep-soft face, but a third thing, a weighing, the look of someone who had learned to assess almost everything that came before her and was applying that same instrument to him. You move quietly, she said. Occupational. Your arm isn't paining you. It is, he said, but not in a way that changes anything. She returned her attention to the window. He came to stand beside her, close enough to look at the same view, far enough to give her the choice of whether to acknowledge him or not. The plateau was vast and still. In the far distance, he could make out the shimmer that was the northern ice shelf, and above it the particular quality of sky that frost worlds developed at altitude. A pale blue-purple that was somehow colder to look at than any other color he'd encountered. This room, he said, isn't on the map because you don't want it to be. She didn't answer immediately. It is the room I used as a child, she said finally. Before I was queen, it is not a room anyone else has a use for, so it has remained mine. A room that still belongs to the person you were before the court got to you. She looked at him sharply. Not a criticism, he said. No, she said after a moment, I know. They stood in silence for a while. The frost world did what frost worlds did. It pushed cold through the glass in a low, continuous pressure, and the lanterns set in the walls made the room's stone glow amber and warm in contrast. It was the specific combination, he thought, that made cold places feel intimate when you were inside them, the outside pressing in, the inside holding. My court, she said, believes you are attempting to leverage your injury into a position. What kind of position? A permanent one. She looked at him steadily. You saved my life, and they believe you are intelligent enough to recognize what that creates and are now maneuvering. He nodded slowly. What do you believe? She turned back to the window. I believe, she said, that I am doing the maneuvering and I have not yet decided in which direction. He absorbed that. Can I ask you something? He said. You may ask. Why didn't you let them move me to the infirmary? She was quiet for a long beat. The thing she was holding, he could see it now, a small carved piece of pale blue stone, the shape of an animal he didn't recognize, turned slowly in her fingers. My father was a general before he was a king, she said. He died of a wound taken in service. He was moved to the infirmary. He was treated by physicians who were very skilled. A pause. He died alone, in a room by himself, because there was no one who had the standing to sit beside a king's body in his last hours without it becoming a political statement. The frozen plateau held its shape outside the glass. "You sat beside me," he said, "so I wouldn't wake up alone." "I sat beside you," she said carefully, "to monitor your condition. Your physician told me the wound was not complicated enough to require monitoring." The carved stone turned in her fingers. "Deetha," she said, "should learn discretion. She seems like an honest woman." "She is an extremely honest woman," Vareth said, with the faintest shade of wry. "It is occasionally inconvenient." He looked at her profile. The composed lines of it, the tension she carried in her jaw, the slight tightening around her eyes that he was beginning to understand, was not coldness but its opposite, something held very carefully because the holding was what her world required. "You could have left when I fell asleep," he said. "I could have," she agreed. "But you didn't." "But I didn't." He said nothing. She said nothing. The frost world was silent outside the glass, and inside the amber glow of the old room they stood beside each other in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was its own kind of information. The first chamberlain came to see him that afternoon. His name was Orvith, a Vare male of late middle age, which meant considerably older than he looked, with the silver-blue skin of his people darkened to a deeper shade at his temples and the backs of his hands. He wore the formal outer robe of his office, a deep gray-black with silver thread at the cuffs and collar, and he moved with the particular measured quality of a man who had learned that appearing unhurried conveyed authority more reliably than appearing efficient. He had the bearing of a man who had spent decades being correct, and had developed a comprehensive private certainty about the world on the basis of that track record. He sat across from Marcus in the guest room with the specific quality of a person who had not yet decided how concerned they were going to allow themselves to appear. He looked at Marcus for a moment before speaking, the way officials did when they were establishing a read, taking inventory, assessing, deciding which register to open in. "You understand," Orvith said, "the position you are in." "I took a knife for your queen," Marcus said. "I'm not sure the position is that complicated." "The position," Orvith said, "is that you have been given access you should not have, and the court is watching to see what you do with it." "What access am I not supposed to have?" Orvith looked at him for a moment. "Her sovereignty," he said carefully, "has not had a personal interest in anyone in 11 years, not since before she took the throne. The court has settled into an understanding of how she operates. She is the ice sovereign. She is efficient and fair, and she does not allow personal considerations to complicate political ones. This is not cruelty. It is simply how she has governed, and the court has organized itself around it. And I've disrupted that." "You have disrupted that." Marcus leaned back in the chair, resting the braced arm on the arm of it with the care that the new healing required. Outside the window, the late afternoon light on the plateau was doing something extraordinary, turning the frost cover into a pale gold that was completely at odds with everything the world otherwise communicated about itself. He watched it for a moment. "What do you want from me, Chamberlain?" "I want to understand your intentions." "My intentions," Marcus said, returning his gaze to Orvith with the same directness he used for everything, "were to do the job I was paid to do and go home. Then someone tried to kill your queen in a corridor I happened to be standing in, and I did what seemed like the reasonable thing. I don't have long-term intentions. I have a healing arm and a guest room, and a contract that is probably voided by the suspension of the negotiations." Orvith regarded him with the flatness of a man who dealt in information for a living, and was not yet sure whether he was receiving it honestly. The flatness was not skeptical exactly. It was the carefully maintained neutral of someone who had learned that first responses were almost never accurate, and that patience was the correct tool. "Her sovereignty canceled 3 meetings this morning." "I've heard." "She has not done that before, not in 11 years. "Then maybe," Marcus said, "something happened this week that warranted it." Orvith was quiet for a long moment. The plateau light outside the window shifted, the gold cooling back toward white. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped a register into something more direct, the voice beneath the official one, the one he probably used when he was doing the part of his job that wasn't recorded. She was not before the throne. There was someone. He died in the second year of her reign in the border incursions with the Selhari. She has not been the same since. He paused. I do not mean that she fell apart. She did not fall apart. She governed through it, and she has governed through everything since. I mean only that the part of her that was willing to be personally present to another person became unavailable, closed off. She has not opened it. Marcus looked at the window of the guest room. The same plateau, different angle, same cold sky. You're telling me this, he said, because you want me to understand something about her that she hasn't told me. I am telling you this, Orvith said, because if you are what you appear to be, a decent man who found himself in an unremarkable situation and acted well, then I believe you should understand the stakes of what you are now adjacent to. He paused. And if you are not what you appear to be, then I have told you nothing you could not eventually discover yourself, and I have bought the satisfaction of watching your face while I said it. Which is it? Orvith studied him for one more moment. I am still deciding, he said. He stood, smoothed his formal robe with the tidiness of a man who managed small things carefully, because the large ones were often beyond his control. She will want to see you this evening. I suspect she will not acknowledge that she wants this and will instead find a plausible administrative reason. He moved to the door. I will give you some advice, free of charge. All right. Do not pretend not to notice the real reason. He left. Marcus sat with the silence for a while. The guest room window showed the inner courtyard, darkening now as the Frostworld's short afternoon gave way to the long blue dusk that preceded full night. The courtyard lanterns came on one by one, maintained by a staff member he had not yet identified, and the blue-veined stone of the lower walls caught their light and scattered it into something that was almost luminescent. It was a beautiful world, in its specific cold way. He had not particularly registered that in the first days of his contract. He'd been focused on the job, but he registered it now. Orvith's information sat in his mind with the particular weight of something he needed to handle carefully. A man who had died. 11 years of vacancy where something warm had been. A queen who had built a reputation for perfect composure over a grief she had never publicly acknowledged and apparently never been permitted to, because a king's grief was a political statement, and she had not been allowed the human luxury, the bare luxury of it. He understood, without quite being able to articulate it fully, why she had stayed. It was not, or not entirely, about him. It was about the specific action of not leaving, of remaining in a room with a person who was hurt and alone and would have woken without her, to the white ceiling of an infirmary and the faces of physicians doing their jobs, and nothing else in the room that had anything to do with him personally. She had known that feeling. She had decided, for reasons she was still not fully showing him, that she would not let it happen to someone else if she could prevent it. It was a small act. It was not a small act. He had been in enough difficult situations to know the difference. He watched the courtyard lanterns hold their circles of warmth against the gathering dusk and thought about what Orvith had said. If you are what you appear to be, a decent man who acted well. He had been assessed for that. He was still being assessed. He thought that was fair. 11 years was a long time to learn not to trust quickly, and he had been in the fortress for less than 2 weeks, and the fact that something real had happened in a corridor did not obligate her to believe he was what he appeared to be without evidence. He would have to give her evidence. Not perform it, just live it and let it accrue. The plausible administrative reason was that her personal guard rotation needed restructuring in the wake of the assassination attempt, and as the outside observer she had contracted for the negotiation period, his professional assessment of the existing protocols would be, in the first Chamberlain's careful phrasing, of value. He reported to her private meeting room at the second evening hour. She was already there. No court staff, no attendants. A table with a map of the fortress spread across it, guard positions marked in 2 colors. She was studying it when he came in, and she did not immediately acknowledge him, not dismissal. He had come to understand, but the way she managed time when she was thinking. She finished her thought before she looked up. "The East Wing approach," she said without preamble. "I want to understand how the delegate moved through it undetected." It was a genuine question. He could see that. Whatever else this meeting was, the tactical problem was real, and she was the kind of person who handled real problems even when the context around them was complicated. He came to the table. They spent an hour on it. He walked her through the sight line gaps in the east corridor, the positions that had been covered by her guard rotation and the 2 positions that hadn't been, the specific set of choices that had put him in the right place at the wrong time or the right time, depending on how you weighted outcomes. She asked sharp questions. She remembered detail. She didn't take notes because, he realized, she didn't need to. She had the kind of memory that filed things on first contact and retrieved them without apparent effort. When they had covered the corridor, she straightened. "The rotation will need to be revised," she said. The rotation and the briefing protocol for the delegate staff. The third-seat delegate was not flagged for additional observation. "I'll speak to the guard commander." "Tonight." She looked at him. "Tomorrow." He nodded. He began to fold the map she let him, which was itself something, because the map was hers and he was a mercenary she'd contracted, and a different kind of ruler would have taken it from him immediately. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You asked me that this morning as well." "You let me ask it this morning." She waited. "Orvith came to see me." Her expression shifted by a fraction, not surprise, but the adjustment of someone who had expected something and received confirmation of it. "Of course he did. He told me about 11 years ago." She was quiet. She moved to the window of this room, also north-facing, he noticed, which meant she chose north views when she chose windows, which was a small thing that told him something, and she looked out. "He should not have done that," she said. "He thought I should understand the stakes." "And do you?" He looked at her back, the straight line of her spine, the way she stood at windows, not for the view exactly, but with the specific quality of someone who needed a direction to face that wasn't the room. "I think," he said carefully, "that you're very good at being a queen, and I think that's cost you some things. And I think that when someone does something that bypasses the queue of official interactions and just lands, you don't know what to do with it." She turned. "You landed on me," he said. "That's not a complaint, I'm just naming what I see." She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he began to think he'd miscalculated, that the directness was too much, that the court version of her was going to reassert, and he was going to be escorted back to the guest room and quietly removed from the fortress in the morning. "You're very calm," she said. "Usually. Most people find it difficult to be calm around me." "I noticed," he met her eyes, "I'm not most people." "No," she said, "you are not." She crossed the room. Not to the table, to where he was standing, stopping a foot away, looking up at him with those winter sky eyes that had been composed and then unguarded and then composed again, and were now doing something he hadn't seen before. Not performing, not calculating, just looking. "My court," she said quietly, "will not accept this easily." "I know. It will be a significant difficulty." "Yes. And you contracted for a 6-week period of which 4 days have been disrupted by an assassination attempt. So technically your employment is in a somewhat ambiguous status." "Verith," he said. She stopped. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Her breath was very controlled. He could see the control of it in the slight tension across her collarbones. Then something shifted. The way something shifts when a person has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and finally, quietly, puts it down. She did not cry. He would not have expected her to cry. But the tension changed quality, and she looked at him with her face entirely in that third register, the weighing one, and what he saw in it now was not assessment exactly. It was relief. "You're going to be infuriating," she said, "aren't you?" "Probably," he said. "Yes." The court had opinions. The court had a great many opinions over the following weeks, and it expressed them through the available channels: formal inquiry from the High Council, an unofficial communication from 3 of the 5 noble houses, suggesting that a more appropriate recognition of the mercenaries' service might take the form of a significant monetary award, and a polite contract termination, and a somewhat pointed dinner at which every seat had been carefully arranged to leave Marcus Vale at the furthest possible table from the Queen while still technically having him in the same room. In those weeks he learned her in the way you learned someone when proximity was consistent and real rather than managed, the small things that the court version of her did not show. He learned that she woke slowly and with something that was, in anyone else, recognizable as reluctance, and that she compensated for this by maintaining absolute stillness in the first minutes after waking rather than rising immediately, as though she needed a few moments to assemble herself for the day. He learned that she had strong opinions about the fortress's heating distribution that were entirely reasonable, but that she never raised in any formal setting, because the facilities question was beneath the level she was expected to operate at. He learned that the carved stone animal she carried in her private room was a veth, a creature from the northern plateau that was extinct now, had been for decades, which she had told him in the same flat tone she used for all facts she did not want to be asked to expand on. He had not asked her to expand. He learned that she laughed quietly, with her mouth closed, in a way that looked almost like she was suppressing it, and that this was not suppression but simply the form her laugh took, and that it arrived suddenly and without warning in response to things he often hadn't expected to land. He learned that she read in the late evening after the day's work was done, and that the books she chose were not political histories or strategic texts but older things, narratives, he gathered, though he could not read the Ver script. He learned that she moved differently when she was not being observed, with a looseness her court posture did not allow, not careless, never careless, but less armored. He tried to give her the same in return. He was aware that he was also being learned, that her attention was comprehensive even when it appeared casual, and that she was assembling a picture of him the way she assembled all pictures, carefully, from evidence, with the long patience of a woman who had stopped trusting first impressions some years before he had met her. He tried not to perform. He tried to simply be what he was, in the same rooms, doing his work when work was available, and occupying the space honestly when it wasn't. He repaired a hinge on the north room door that had been wrong for some time. He did it without mentioning it because it did not need mentioning. The hinge was wrong and he had the tools in his kit and the capacity to fix it, and so he fixed it. She noticed when she next came to the room and stood at the door for a moment and said nothing, and he saw her clock it. It joined the list of evidences. She had rearranged the seating. She had done it in front of the first chamberlain, the High Council representative, and most of the assembled noble houses, with the specific unhurried quality of someone who had decided, which was the most frightening quality she possessed. She had moved his card to the seat on her left and sat down, and the room had been quiet in the way a room goes quiet when something that cannot be undone has just happened in front of witnesses. He had not made it easy for her. That is to say, he had not made himself smaller, and he had not made himself larger. He had been what he was, a man who did his job carefully, who spoke when he had something to say and didn't when he didn't, who treated the fortress staff with the same directness he treated the High Council. This had confused the court, which had been expecting either supplication or opportunism, and received neither. He had also, on the 14th day, saved the second kitchen master from a falling scaffold in the storage wing, which had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the fact that he had been walking past the storage wing when the scaffold started to go. The second kitchen master had very strong opinions about the human after that. These opinions circulated. The High Council requested a formal audience with the Queen in the 4th week. He was not present for it, that was appropriate, and he did not push for inclusion. He heard about it from Ditha, who heard it from the physician's aide, who had been restocking a supply cabinet adjacent to the council chamber. Varith had listened to the High Council's formal objections for the full allotted time. She had not interrupted. She had asked 2 questions at the end, both of which were unanswerable. What precisely was the protocol she had violated, and what precisely was the formal objection to a human, given that the Ver had maintained human trade partnerships for 3 centuries, and the treaty negotiations whose collapse had brought a human mercenary to the fortress in the first place, had been intended to govern human-Ver relations in 2 border systems. The High Council had retired to consider these questions. She had not moved to the north window room to think about it after. She had come, instead, to the guest room, which was no longer really a guest room in the way it had been initially, because his things had migrated into it in that incremental way things migrated when a stay extended beyond its original parameters. She sat on the edge of the bed. He sat in the chair opposite. They had been in that configuration for an hour, talking about nothing consequential, the structural repairs the fortress needed in the east wing, whether the frost this season was heavier than the previous years, the specific and apparently long-standing disagreement between the head cook and the second kitchen master that predated Marcus's arrival and had nothing to do with him. "They'll come back with a formal challenge to your authority on the matter," he said, at a natural break. "Yes. What will you do?" She looked at her hands, the silver-blue nails, the composed certainty of a woman who held things together by the specific force of her own consistency. "What I do with formal challenges," she said. "Receive them, answer them, make my position clear." "And your position is?" "That I am the Queen of Ver," she said simply, "and I have held this world together for 11 years, and the High Council has not disagreed with me on matters of actual governance in 8 of those years, which suggests that my judgment is not in question in the areas that matter." She paused. "And that what I choose with my own life, in the areas that are mine to choose, is not a matter for the High Council to govern." He looked at her. "That's a significant statement." "Yes. The court will call it headstrong." "The court," she said, with that faint shade of wry he had come to watch for, "has called me headstrong since my 3rd week on the throne. I have had 11 years to make peace with that assessment." He leaned forward in the chair, elbows on his knees. "Varith." She looked at him. "I need you to tell me what you want. Not what you're calculating, not what is diplomatically sustainable, what you want." Her chin lifted slightly, the automatic response, the sovereignty in it. Then she let it go. "I want," she said, "for the room to stop feeling like it's only temporarily occupied." A pause. "I want to not have been the only person in it for 11 years. Then it doesn't have to be." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the space between the chair and the bed and put her hand over his, just that, just the weight and warmth of it, silver-blue nails and cool alien skin, and the particular steadiness of a woman who had survived a very long time being exactly what her world required. "You're going to be here," she said, "when I wake up." "Yes. And when my court objects. I'll be there then too." She looked at their hands. She was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was filing something, putting it in the place she intended to keep it. "I don't know," she said finally, "how to do this without it being a political event." "You don't have to," he said. "It's already a political event. That happened when you didn't leave." He turned his hand under hers, holding it properly, So we start from there. The formal recognition came on the 43rd day. It was not called a bond declaration, because that was a Ver ceremony with specific weight, and Verith had understood the importance of not rushing the specific weight of things. It was called, instead, a formal appointment Marcus Vale, under the official title of Sovereign's Council External, with duties that were technically administrative and actually meant he went where she went and stayed where she stayed, and the court could either adapt or spend the rest of its working life in formal objection. Most of the court adapted. The High Council adapted fastest, which was the surprise, but Orvith explained it after with the tone of a man who had seen this coming and was prepared to be modest about it. "They're political creatures," he said. "When something is inevitable, they adapt to it. The debate was about whether it was inevitable." You answered that question. The three noble houses that had sent the unofficial communication about a monetary award and contract termination did not attend the formal appointment ceremony. Two of them sent gifts the following week. The third sent a carefully worded letter that was, when translated out of its formal register, approximately an apology. He framed it and put it on the wall of what was no longer a guest room. She found it there 3 days later and looked at it for a long time with an expression that was, unmistakably, amusement. "You're going to leave that up," she said. "For the historical record," he said. "The historical record. When people ask how this started, I want a document on hand." She turned to look at him with the weighing expression, which was also now occasionally accompanied by a softness around the eyes that she did not try to conceal in the way she had initially. "And what will the document say?" she asked. "It will say," he told her, "that a queen sat beside a mercenary all night because she didn't want him to wake up alone, and then refused to pretend that hadn't happened, and that was that." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's not a very formal account." "No," he agreed. "But it's accurate." She stood there in the light of the north room, the old room, the one that had been hers before the throne, with her silver hair loose and the working robe she wore when she was not performing queen, and she looked at the framed letter on the wall of what had once been a space she kept for herself, and she said nothing. But she reached for his hand. And that, in the end, was the record worth keeping. He still woke sometimes and didn't immediately know where he was. The mercenary's instinct taking inventory before opening his eyes, running the body checklist, listening for the quality of silence in the room. It was a habit of years. It did not disappear. But in the inventory he ran now, the first thing registered before sight was the warmth. Warmth at his left side. The specific weight of it, the particular quality that was hers, cool at the surface, warming fast at contact, her hair soft against his shoulder when she slept curled toward him. The second thing was the ceiling. Carved stone, pale gray-white, veined with blue mineral threads that caught the light from the lantern left at low burn on the table, because she had learned that he slept more easily with a small light than in full dark, and she had not commented on this, simply arranged it. He opened his eyes. The Ver fortress held its cold silence around them. The plateau was dark and still beyond the glass. The lantern made its familiar amber field. And beside him, the Queen of Ver, Frostworld Sovereign, Iron Sky Queen, the woman who had not left when she could have, slept with her face turned toward his shoulder and her hand resting easy at his ribs. He lay still and watched the ceiling and thought, not for the first time and with a clarity that had not dimmed in the weeks since the formal appointment, that the most important moment of his professional life had been a bad knife angle and 30 centimeters of corridor. He would not have arranged it differently. She shifted. He knew her waking rhythms now, the way she came up from sleep in stages, the slight change in breathing that came a minute or two before her eyes opened, the single deep breath she took before she returned to the surface of herself. He knew, too, that for those few seconds between sleep and full waking, her face was still in the unguarded mode. The one she had shown him in that first morning. The one that was neither queen nor performance, but simply the woman who had spent 11 years carrying more than most people were built to hold. He liked those seconds. He tried not to need them in a way she would find smothering, but he was honest enough with himself to know he kept them. She opened her eyes. Pale winter sky, the color he still didn't have a name for and had stopped needing one. She looked at him. "Still here," she said. "Still here," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, in the way that a lot of things she did were almost but specifically not quite the full version, held in reserve in the way she held things. He had learned to read the almost. "Good," she said. She did not move away. She closed her eyes again, and her hand shifted slightly at his ribs, not tightening exactly, just resting, remaining. Outside, the frost world pressed its cold against the glass. The lantern held its quiet circle of amber. And in the north room of the Vare fortress, in the first pale hours before the court woke and the day reassembled itself into its official shape, two people lay in the specific warmth of the space they had made between them and were easy. It was enough. It was, as it turned out, more than enough. It was everything.